This session, we're going to look at the 6 main elements of projects that we need to monitor and track through projects, right? And then look at the relationship between them and look at the relationship between them and how we can use them and control them, probably from a different perspective as well. So there are 6 elements. The first 2 main ones we always think about are time and costs. They're linked obviously to an understanding of the quality of what we're solution, and we'll look at that one in particular, and scope. After all, at the end of the day, right, what we're looking to do here is deliver the scope of the project, right? Make sure it is quality, and there's a particular phrase we use here, fit for purpose. So we're going to explain that in a moment too. We need to deliver it to a time scale, usually on time, because the whole point of trying to deliver on time is that it can actually blow the whole purpose of the project. If I have to have a time to date, time to market or something or other, beat the competition or time frame like a calendar for whatever it happens to be, I need to make sure I do that on time. Otherwise the whole point of the project is probably lost, right? Cost is also fairly important because obviously we need to make sure from a cost within the budget, return on investment, cost of ownership, all these things we need to look at as well. Now, realistically, there is a linkage between all these 4 main elements, as we know. Sometimes called the iron triangle, golden triangle, which is a bit of a funny thing because it's sort of a triangle, but it's not. But there is a linkage. For instance, most of the time, we need to try and make sure we deliver the scope. That's what we're out to do. And as I say, we've looked at scope in a couple of times in different other sessions. To explain that in more detail, we need to make sure the quality of that scope is right, fit for purpose. And when we mean fit for purpose here, we mean it is going to do the job it is meant to do. No gold plating, and certainly no less, and in most cases no more than we actually need, with all intents and purposes. Right? And we have a time frame that we need to do that, and it costs around that, right? Because the business needs it done in a certain time, and we have a cost that we need to keep under the budget. Remember, there's a difference between budget, that which we have allocated to the project from a business perspective, and the cost, that amount it's going to take to build the solution and deliver it. Now, the cost is obviously linked to time. The more time we spend, the more it's going to cost. Sometimes we can spend more time and it doesn't cost so much, but at the end of the day, there's still a correlation between that. Sometimes we can actually stick to time, still have more cost because we put more resources into it within the same time frame. Right? But usually, time has more of a consideration than costs for many reasons. But there's a linkage. So to try and deliver the scope on time, sometimes I need more time, sometimes I need to add more resources to deliver it. And sometimes, and I say that with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, there is this little red line that goes across here, right? At which point we have fixed idea here, the scope is fixed, and up here these elements can vary. Now, they all can vary, obviously, and we've known this, right? And I'll talk about the scope variation in a minute. But the general view is, like a traditional view, when we go through the design phase, the planning phase, we want to make sure we've got all the specs, all the scope understood, and lock that in. But you know, that isn't actually really that realistic in many, many cases, in probably most cases actually. But we'll look at that in a minute. Now, there are a couple of other elements we need to add on here, of course. One of them is risk. I'm going to put that above the line here because there's always a certain amount of risk, as we said. That's one of the 5 characteristics. Risk, uncertainty. You know, projects have a certain amount of uncertainty about them, but also there is risk within the project itself. Understanding the solution, the stability of the team, understanding from the business, the marketplace, all these things are risks, and appetite of the company, etc., and capacity of the risk for the company. So these things are there. They all can vary from one part of the project to the next, depending on what you're doing. Linked to that, of course, is something also equally important, and from a business perspective, the most important area, and that is the benefit expected from the project. Right? The benefit expected from the project. Now, put that in the middle. At the moment, it's in the middle, as you'll see. But that is what we're really looking to deliver. That also has a variation on it. In some methods, like with Prince2, we have tolerances around this, and those are saying how much we can absorb mainly from a reporting point of view. This is really managed by exception and a point of empowerment, right? This doesn't give you a boundary to use that space. It's more about triggering an escalation because you're going beyond those bounds, but allowing you having empowerment to work within those boundaries to start before you need to do that, right? So it's a guidance, as again, right? So we have benefit because obviously as we monitor the project, we want to ensure that as the project is being building the solution, does it look like it's going to indicate what it might do from a point of view of realize those benefits once the project's closed? Because we can actually look at deploying stuff during the project, deploying some parts of the solution and seeing if that's actually working or an indication of how it might work. Might not get the full benefit right now, but the idea will indicate whether it might work afterwards. And this is another really good benefit of, good benefit of course, one of the great practices of deploying as we go through. How you do that really depends on what the business need and what the project also is best to do with in the project. So we have these 6 elements: time, cost, quality, scope, risk, and benefit that we need to monitor in some form or another. Now, let's get to a couple of things here regarding quality. The quality needs to be fit for purpose, right? It has to do the job it is going to do. And that job is to realize the benefit. And therefore, that is linked to the scope. Right? It needs to do the job it is going to do. Now, quite often, we get the idea that we have to deliver all the scope within the project that we design at the beginning of the project, through initiating, foundations, or whatever it happens to be, whatever mechanism you're using. Right? But our challenge, think about this. Any projects you've actually worked on, have you actually delivered the whole scope, right? And I don't mean things have changed. I mean, have you delivered really what you're expected to deliver throughout the whole project by the end of the project? And I'm pretty certain in a lot of cases you're going to say, well, no, right? The next question then is, has the solution still realized the beneficial change you wanted or desired at the end of the project? Hopefully, most cases, yes. In other words, I had a successful project. Now, in some cases, you might not have. And I've had people coming telling me, well, the solution's being delivered, time, costs, right? They delivered what they could, but the solution hasn't worked, right? We've had to miss some scope off. And this is where the next question comes in. Were you able to realize what scope you could leave off without impacting on the solution, without impacting on the quality, a fit-for-purpose solution? Because sometimes when the project hasn't been successful, hasn't realized the beneficial change it wanted at the level it needed, quite often it's because we've missed something of the scope off, and therefore it is impacted on that fit-for-purpose. Right. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. Let's have a look at the point of the fact that we actually realize that sometimes we can leave scope off. So let's have a look at a different diagram to wonder what that actually means from an impact point of view. So if we say that the scope can therefore vary, let me write that up here, scope. Right. Now the thing is, normally we tend to use time and cost as a contingency. Right? I need more time and or costs to help me make sure I deliver this. But I can't have them all at the top end. Something's got to actually lock in. And quite often we say time is of the essence, as we said there. Time needs to be fixed in many cases. And realistically, if that's fixed, then ought to be saying, well, okay, we need to lock in costs to all intents and purposes. Right? So here we have these two here. Now, if we want to make sure the solution is fit for purpose, quality therefore also needs to be under that red line here. All right, so I'll put a boundary around them all. Again, benefit's still there. Risk isn't going to change very much. The risk perception may change because we're going to look at things slightly differently. But that's just the perception of how the change is. What is important is that there's still a strong linkage between these 4 areas. Right? As we said, scope needs to be fit for purpose. We need to make sure there's a linkage between these two because time and cost are intrinsically linked, one form or another, but we need to make sure that they do work together. And the point here is these 3 here should be locked in. We've got to have a fit for purpose solution. It needs to be fit for purpose. Right? We've got to lock time and costs in to make sure that we don't go over the boundaries and therefore past the point of no return where the project may not work anymore or not realise the beneficial change. Could we miss the deadline, for instance? Sometimes business need costs because it's related to benefits, it's related to the budget to the project, and also related to the return on their investment and how they may calculate that as well. So it's all linkage, and we'll look at the return on investment, etc., linked to quality in another session. Right? So the thing is, if these are locked, then somehow I have to have some other adjustments. Now, we've already looked at scope and said, well, some cases scope can actually be, some of it be left off, right? And what are we doing there when we look at that particular mechanism? We're using a technique called prioritization, right? And there are many forms of prioritization, okay, right? Mandate, need those, ought to have them in place, they could be left off. Moscow prioritization, must, should, coulds and won'ts, ordering processes, 1, 2, 3, critical lists, all sorts of ways of doing it. Probably the most common one, the most well-known one is Moscow. So we'll have a look at that one in particular. But it's not so much that particular element that's important, it's how it is used and what it represents, okay? So, what are we trying to do here? What's the purpose of all this? If I want to make sure that I deliver the fit for purpose solution, in this case, I make sure I deliver all the scope so it realizes my beneficial change and links to the quality of the solution, I need to understand really what are the core elements of the requirements that I need to get across the line, that I need to deliver, right? What are the core elements that are going to realize this beneficial change for me, right? So prioritization, that means I have a list of musts to start with, right? These are the high-level requirements and the major parts of the solution, well, the requirements that I must deliver for the solution to work, right? And that's why we need to understand that quite early on. Now, of course, that could change. Remember when we talked about the 5 characteristics? That can change throughout the project. The scope could change a little bit and a lot. We'll talk a bit more about how Moscow works and type prioritization in a general in another session. Okay. So the must-haves are there to start with. Now, a lot of elements have what we call should-haves. Those sets of requirements, products that we ought to get across the line. Without them, it will still work, but we can have a workaround. So it's painful to leave out. Okay. I'll look at that in a more simple diagram in a minute. So we have the must-haves. We have the shoulds. Okay, that we ought to deliver. And then, out of that, there's the icing on the cake, as it were. There are a set of requirements that we don't need at all. Now, there's one very important thing to remember, and we'll look at Bill Wake's idea about invest on some parts of defining requirements. One important aspect, it all need to give value, even those we may not end up delivering. It needs to be part of the scope if it gives value. If it doesn't give value, then really we shouldn't be having it in the scope at all, right? So we have the shoulds and we have those that we could leave out and it will not impact on the solution as much as leaving the shoulds out. The interesting thing about these, they're not critical at all, right? In other words, we ought to be delivering the shoulds, we have to deliver the musts, the coulds. If they leave them off, it doesn't have any impact whatsoever. Right? Yeah, that value is there and we just said that. But if we don't deliver them, they don't matter. And what are these? These requirements become our contingency. And we'll look at that in more detail later. By contingency, that means if I'm running out of time to knock impact on time and cost, and I need more time to deliver certain requirements, I can use my could-haves to give me more space within the time frame I'm using, the time box, or even the work package, but usually we call it the time box. Gives me more time in the time box. It can help me within stages, increments. It can help me with overall of the project to ensure that I deliver the minimum subset here, the must-haves, and hopefully most, if not all, the shoulds, and as many of the coulds as I can. We'll always work backwards from the coulds and then the shoulds. Certainly never get to the must. This is alarm bells ringing. In fact, if you're starting to impact on the shoulds, you're doing that already, really. Right? This is part of the exception, managed by exception thing. And that's where the tolerance is. We put a tolerance on scope by prioritizing to understand what I must deliver for the solution to work, what should be delivered, ought to be delivered, but I can leave out if I have to because I've got a workaround for the moment. The could haves that really I don't need if I don't need to have them, if I need to have the time, cost element, the effort for another element that's important, another requirement that's very important, mainly the musts. And that's the contingency. And then part of that, what's left over, if we have sometimes like things called won'ts, will not deliver this time round, we can do that. And that's actually when we look at the scope scenario again, look at that session, you'll see when we come out, parts of those might end up being in the out part of the scope throughout the project. Initially, that session looked at what we defined at the beginning of it. Remember, any could that now becomes a won't, now becomes out of scope for the rest of the project. But sometimes can come back in again if we suddenly find we're picking up time or the scope changes, we can pull things in. Good thing about that is that, remember, these coulds are not so crucial for the project, but we can still deliver them after the project's closed. We can use that doing Scrum in a product environment, in operational mode, which we'll look at in a separate session as well, looking at operations and project environments, right? So remember that. If any could we do not deliver throughout the project, we can still do that through an operational mode through Scrum or some other similar mechanism as a product delivery. Doesn't impact on the overall environment, the operational environment at this point. Okay, so here we have to the traditional view where time and cost and quality sort of vary, a bit difficult on the quality one, but we quite often give more time on the project, bumps up the costs, or we add more resources, bumps up the cost, the time is still the same, right? And that has an impact on the ROI in particular. So I'll put that in here, ROI, impact, okay? All because most of the time we feel we need to deliver the whole scope. But like we said, sometimes we don't. And that gives us an indication that if sometimes we can leave scope out and the solution still works, we've got another form of contingency, but we also need to concentrate on what scope we must deliver. So if we switch the whole diagram around, this changes everything. Right. Still allows us to deliver the benefits we need because now we understand what those requirements are from the scope perspective to do that. Right, in here. We've still got a risk, but in a different format because we may have a risk of understanding and making sure we're prioritizing right, but the other risks are still there. We ensure the quality of the fit for purpose solution because we're delivering what we must do, minimum at least, but the most we should be coming backwards, and we can lock in time and costs. Time because we need to deliver on time in most cases, and cost because again of the ROI impact.